Generosity just like shines. Meghan Markle recently said that you reached out to her and said, come, you can live in my home.
Stay in my house.
Yeah, it was a very difficult time for them. And what I know about the two of them, and I wish the world knew how much they love these two people love each other. They found each other out of all these odds against them finding each other, they found each other. And the love that they have is really, really moving. And I just wanted to
As Ever is also cooking. Just had another launch.
Yes.
The rosé sold out also in less than an hour.
44 minutes. I was shocked.
How do you keep up with demand?
When you sell out that quickly, it's a double-edged sword because it's an incredible thing to happen for any small business and any startup. And at the same time, you don't get the same metrics and learnings about.
Meghan and Harry, you owe me a serious chunk of change. That loan for your Montecito mansion. If it is not paid back within 30 days, I will have no choice but to take this to court. Imagine a voice cutting through the cold December air in 2025. Steady, direct, and carrying the weight of a man who built everything from nothing. Tyler Perry did not drop the message through a press release or a polished public statement. He used his own radio show, and with a few sharp words, he sent shockwaves through Montecito. The message was simple and devastating. Harry and Meghan owed him money, and the clock was running. In that moment, the carefully polished image of their California reinvention began to fracture. For years, the world had been sold a story about two royals who walked away from the institution to build an independent life in America. The picture looked perfect from the outside. There was the sprawling mansion, the glossy streaming deals, the carefully staged appearances, and the promise of total freedom. But as Perry's ultimatum began to dominate headlines in early 2026, a darker version of the story started to emerge. What had been presented as independence now looked more like a fragile structure held together by the wealth and patience of powerful friends. The 30-day deadline was not just gossip. It felt like the kind of countdown that could end with public embarrassment, legal action, and possibly the loss of the very house that symbolized their new beginning. When Harry and Meghan first arrived in Los Angeles after leaving Canada in 2020, Tyler Perry stepped in as their protector. He gave them his Beverly Hills mansion as a temporary sanctuary and provided the level of security they said they desperately needed. At the time, it looked like an act of rare generosity from a friend who understood their situation. But whispers later suggested that his support went much further than lending them a house. As the couple searched for a permanent home in Montecito, insiders began claiming that Perry also helped them financially, allegedly extending a massive friendship loan to help secure the estate. It was said to be the kind of arrangement made on trust, on loyalty, and on belief in the value of the Sussex brand. But in elite circles, trust only lasts, while the money keeps moving. By early 2026, the tone had changed completely. The man who had once been seen as their rescuer was now being described as someone tired of waiting, tired of being ignored, and ready to collect. That shift became even more striking when Perry publicly distanced himself from the story that he helped them settle into California life. The warmth was gone. The closeness seemed gone too. Rumors spread that calls about repayment were no longer being answered, and that what started as a generous private arrangement had become a source of serious tension. If even Tyler Perry had reached the point of issuing ultimatums, it suggested that something much bigger was going wrong behind the gates of Montecito. The mansion itself, once presented as proof that they had successfully reinvented themselves, now looked less like a triumph and more like a trap. It had everything that signaled status. Multiple bedrooms and bathrooms, a tennis court, rose gardens, and sweeping views that made it feel like a private kingdom by the ocean. It was supposed to be their fortress, their sanctuary, their statement to the world that they had made it on their own terms. But the beauty of the estate concealed the brutal cost of keeping it alive. The mortgage was enormous. The property taxes alone were staggering. Security, which they treated as non-negotiable, reportedly consumed millions every year. Beyond the glamour, the mansion demanded constant cash flow just to function. Keeping the lights on, the grounds maintained, the staff paid, and the gates secure required a level of financial stability that few people in the world could comfortably sustain. And as their major income streams began to weaken, the house started to look less like a home and more like a liability waiting to swallow them whole. Even the local reputation surrounding the property became sour. Some neighbors were said to be frustrated by the disruption and spectacle. Financial commentators began describing the house as an unlucky asset, not just because of its huge upkeep, but because of the risks tied to the area and the burden of such an oversized estate. What once looked like a bold entry into American luxury now seemed like a debt-heavy gamble made at exactly the wrong time. While the mansion drained them physically and financially, Archewell faced its own wave of problems. The organization was supposed to be the professional vehicle that gave their new life purpose and legitimacy. It was meant to blend philanthropy, influence, and global reach into one modern power brand. Instead, it began attracting scrutiny. Questions were raised about paperwork, fees, transparency, and financial management. Explanations were offered, but they did little to calm the growing suspicion. Then came the deeper concerns. Reports suggested that donations were falling while expenses were rising. Critics fixated on vague categories in the spending, especially money assigned to unclear service fees. Supporters argued that large organizations often operate in complicated ways, but skeptics saw a pattern of weak transparency and poor accountability. The foundation that was supposed to symbolize impact and purpose was increasingly being portrayed as something driven more by image than by results. Inside the organization, the picture did not seem much better. Stories circulated of a revolving door of staff, with many employees leaving after short and difficult tenures. The same descriptions kept appearing. A workplace focused on optics, publicity, and brand preservation rather than meaningful long-term work. The result was a growing belief that Archewell was not the engine of their future, but another source of strain. At the same time, their entertainment deals no longer looked like the golden lifeline people once imagined. The massive Netflix agreement had initially appeared to secure their future. Their first major project drew huge attention and seemed to confirm that audiences would follow them anywhere. But after that initial success, the momentum weakened. Follow-up projects did not create the same impact, and industry voices became harsher. The glamorous aura of possibility gave way to the reputation of a partnership that had failed to consistently deliver. In Hollywood, that kind of shift happens fast and brutally. One successful release can make you look essential. A string of disappointing follow-ups can make you look expendable. That is where Harry and Meghan seemed to be heading. Executives publicly insisted everything was fine, but reports suggested strain, frustration, and uncertainty about the future of the relationship. If they could not produce another major hit, the renewal that once seemed inevitable began to look increasingly doubtful. That left Meghan's lifestyle brand carrying even more pressure. It was supposed to open a new chapter, turning her image into a profitable business built around food, hosting, beauty, and curated domestic luxury. But the launch invited mockery as much as excitement. Critics attacked the branding, the pricing, and the carefully beige aesthetic, arguing that it felt detached from ordinary people while pretending to speak the language of warmth and simplicity. A quick sellout may have created buzz, but buzz alone could not support a lifestyle built on enormous fixed costs and mounting expectations. Trademark problems only added to the sense that the brand had been rushed or poorly planned. The rebrand may have been necessary, but it also reinforced the impression that the entire project was unstable from the beginning. Even if the products looked elegant online, the business still had to prove it could grow beyond novelty and image. If it failed to scale, it would not become their rescue. It would become just another expensive vanity project tied to a family already under financial pressure. As the pressure built, a new theory began circulating among royal watchers and commentators. They believed the next move would be to present any financial collapse not as mismanagement, but as sabotage. In that version of the story, Harry and Meghan would again position themselves as victims of powerful enemies, hunted by the institution they left and undermined by hostile forces on both sides of the Atlantic. It was seen as a possible final media strategy, one more attempt to turn crisis into sympathy. But by 2026, that strategy looked weaker than before. Public patience had worn thin, polling had softened. Even some former supporters had begun asking uncomfortable questions about why the couple had not achieved the independence they promised when they first left royal life. The emotional narrative that once gave them power no longer carried the same force. At the same time, the possibility of rescue from the royal family appeared to be fading. King Charles was no longer seen as a source of open-ended financial support. William and Catherine were said to be focused on stability, distance, and protecting the institution from more chaos. Harry's legal battles added even more pressure. Though he framed them as a fight for principle and justice, they were also expensive, draining, and risky. Court cases do not just consume energy. They expose records, communications, and financial details that can become dangerous if other creditors are watching closely. That is what made Tyler Perry's deadline feel like more than a private dispute. If the matter moved into a courtroom, it could force open a whole chain of financial questions. Loans, deals, backers, business weaknesses, and private arrangements could all be dragged into the light. And once that happened, the image of empowerment and self-sufficiency might collapse completely. Because the deeper fear was that Perry was not the only person waiting to be repaid. Rumors had already begun spreading that other wealthy backers, including figures from the tech world, may have extended private support when the Sussex transition first began. If those relationships also soured, the problem would no longer be one debt. It would be a network of debts, favors, expectations, and broken trust all converging at once. That is why the situation felt so dangerous. It was not just about one mansion, one brand, or one lawsuit. It was about a whole lifestyle that may have been sustained by reputation and proximity rather than real long-term stability. In those circles, money is never just money. It is access, image, leverage, and influence. Once the aura begins to fade, the generosity can disappear almost overnight. By the end, the Montecito mansion no longer looked like a symbol of freedom. It looked like a monument to overreach. The dream they sold to the world was about escape, reinvention, and a bold new life. But as the pressure mounted, that dream started to resemble a cautionary tale about debt, image, and the price of trying to live like global power players without the structure that once protected them. Now the question is simple. Will they quietly liquidate assets, restructure, and try to survive the storm? Or will they double down, turn everything into another public battle, and risk an even more humiliating collapse in full view of the world? Because in Hollywood, just like in royal life, borrowed glamour only lasts for so long. Eventually, the bill comes due. The mansion that was supposed to prove Harry and Meghan had made it in America was slowly turning into the very thing that could destroy them. From the outside, it looked like the perfect symbol of success. It had sweeping views, luxurious grounds, endless rooms, and all the details that made it feel like a private kingdom hidden in Montecito. It was meant to represent freedom, privacy, and a fresh start far away from royal life. But behind the gates, the cost of maintaining that image was becoming impossible to ignore. The mortgage alone was enormous, and the bills did not stop there. Property taxes were massive, security costs were relentless, and the daily expense of keeping such a huge estate running demanded an extraordinary amount of money. What looked glamorous in photographs began to feel more like a financial trap. The house was not simply a home, it was a machine that needed constant cash just to survive. As pressure mounted around the estate, trouble was also growing around Arkewell. The organization was supposed to be the heart of their new life, the place where influence, philanthropy, and purpose would come together under one powerful brand. Instead, it began attracting the wrong kind of attention. Questions about filings, fees, and missing paperwork created the impression of disorder rather than control. Every explanation seemed to create even more doubt. The financial picture only made things worse. Donations appeared to be falling while expenses kept rising, and critics became fixated on vague spending categories that were never fully explained. The foundation that was meant to reflect compassion and impact was increasingly being portrayed as a polished brand with shaky foundations. Instead of looking like a serious force for change, it began to look like another operation struggling to justify its own existence. Inside the organization, the atmosphere sounded just as troubled. Staff departures kept piling up, and the same complaints surfaced again and again. People described a culture where image came first, where publicity mattered more than substance, and where the pressure to protect the brand was stronger than the commitment to the mission. Rather than becoming the engine of their future, Archewell seemed to be turning into one more source of instability. Their entertainment empire was also showing signs of strain. The giant streaming deal that once looked like a guaranteed path to long-term wealth no longer felt secure. Their first major project drew global attention and gave the impression that they had successfully turned royal notoriety into entertainment power. But after that early burst of success, the momentum faded. The follow-up projects failed to generate the same excitement, and Hollywood's patience began to thin. That shift mattered because the streaming deal had been one of the biggest pillars supporting their new life. As long as they looked like bankable stars, the money and opportunity could keep flowing. But once the projects stopped landing, their value in the industry became harder to defend. Public statements tried to reassure everyone that the partnership remained strong, but the rumors told a different story. Tension, disappointment, and uncertainty hung over everything. That left Meghan's lifestyle brand carrying more pressure than ever. It was supposed to open the door to a new phase of independence, one built on elegant products, curated living, and a carefully crafted personal image. But instead of universal admiration, the brand was met with skepticism. The aesthetic was mocked, the pricing raised eyebrows, and the launch felt to many people like style without substance. It generated conversation, but conversation alone was not enough to rescue a household built on such expensive obligations. The brand also stumbled through naming and trademark problems, adding to the sense that the rollout had not been as polished as it was meant to appear. Even if the products created buzz, the business still had to become something real, something lasting, something capable of producing serious money. If it failed to grow beyond image and novelty, it would not save them. It would become just another glossy idea sitting on top of a growing financial problem. At the same time, a new narrative seemed to be forming around them. As the pressure intensified, more people began to suspect that any coming collapse would be framed not as mismanagement, but as persecution. The story would once again become one of betrayal, obstruction, and powerful enemies determined to stop them from succeeding. It was the familiar victim narrative, repackaged for a new crisis. But this time, the public seemed less willing to accept it without question. The sympathy that once gave them enormous power had started to fade. More and more people were asking what exactly had gone wrong and why so many opportunities had produced so little lasting stability. The promise had been freedom, independence, and a thriving new future. Instead, the image now was one of mounting debt, unstable partnerships, and a lifestyle that seemed increasingly difficult to sustain. While all of this was happening, support from the royal family looked more distant than ever. The safety net they may once have counted on no longer seemed available. Their separation from the institution had become real, and so had the financial consequences. Harry's legal battles only added more pressure, draining money, energy, and time, while opening the door to even more public scrutiny. By now, the dream they sold to the world was beginning to look fragile. The mansion, the foundation, the entertainment deals, and the brand were all supposed to work together to create a powerful new chapter. Instead, each one seemed to be carrying its own problems, and together they formed a picture that was much harder to control. What once looked like reinvention was starting to feel like overreach. What made the situation even more dangerous was the growing belief that Tyler Perry was not the only person waiting to be repaid. As more whispers began to circulate, the story widened beyond one loan and one mansion. Rumors suggested that other wealthy backers may also have stepped in during the early years of Harry and Meghan's American transition, drawn in by the promise of influence, visibility, and proximity to a couple who still carried royal mystique. Some of those names were said to come from the world of Silicon Valley, where money often follows ambition, image, and the possibility of cultural relevance. The idea was simple. Investing in Harry and Meghan was not just about business. It was about being close to a global brand that seemed ready to dominate media, philanthropy, and elite social circles all at once. But once the major deals began to weaken and the shine of that brand started to fade, patience reportedly faded with it. What had once looked like generous support now began to resemble a network of private obligations, quietly closing in around them. These were not ordinary bank arrangements with fixed public terms and transparent structures. They were the kind of informal, high-level relationships built on trust, prestige, and expectation. In that world, repayment is not measured only in money. It is measured in access, loyalty, relevance, and results. If the results disappear, the goodwill can vanish just as quickly. That is why the pressure on Harry and Meghan seemed to be intensifying from every direction at once. Their financial problem no longer looked like a single setback. It looked like a liquidity crisis spreading across their entire world. If multiple private supporters were now expecting returns, then the strain on the couple would be far more serious than any public statement could admit. At the same time, the cost of maintaining their post-royal life remained enormous. The Montecito estate still demanded constant money. Security remained one of the biggest burdens, reportedly costing millions each year. For Harry and Meghan, this was never framed as luxury. It was presented as necessity, a level of protection they believed they could not live without. But necessity becomes a brutal thing when the income needed to support it begins to weaken. That financial strain was also said to be bleeding into their professional world. Archewell, which was supposed to represent purpose and stability, increasingly sounded like a place under pressure. Reports of staff turnover continued to build, and the departures created the impression of an operation that could not hold on to its own people. Former employees and insiders were said to describe an atmosphere that felt frantic, image-driven, and constantly reactive. The criticism was not just about personalities, it was about priorities. The accusation was that the public-facing appearance of compassion and impact mattered more than the actual work itself. Money was allegedly being spent on the shell of importance, while the substance underneath remained weak. That kind of reputation can be fatal, especially when a public figure's value depends so heavily on trust. Even the smaller cushions that may have helped sustain them were starting to look unreliable. The renewed attention around Meghan's old acting work may have brought some financial comfort, but it was never likely to be enough to support the kind of life they had built. Residual income can help, but it cannot carry a household structured around prestige, security, and constant public visibility. The lifestyle brand was supposed to change that by creating a serious business with long-term earning power, but even that looked uncertain. The brand may have generated buzz, but buzz is not the same as stability. There is a limit to how far image can carry a product line, especially when the public mood has started to shift. It becomes much harder to sell aspiration when people sense financial panic behind the presentation. The more polished the branding appeared, the more some critics seemed determined to expose the cracks beneath it. Then there were Harry's legal battles, which may have represented principle to him, but also carried enormous risk. Litigation at that level is never just emotional or symbolic. It is expensive, exhausting, and deeply exposing. Even when settlements or victories appear substantial, the legal costs can swallow much of the reward. And the deeper danger lies in disclosure. Court cases open doors that powerful people often spend years trying to keep shut. If more of Harry's financial and private records were pulled into public view, those details could become valuable not just to the press, but to anyone with a financial claim against him. The courtroom could become the place where private arrangements, business weaknesses, and behind-the-scenes dependencies were finally brought into the light. For creditors and former allies, that kind of exposure could become leverage. That is what made the whole picture feel so unstable. Harry and Meghan were no longer just dealing with a public relations problem or a temporary decline in popularity. They seemed to be caught between two collapsing fronts. On one side were personal debts, strained alliances, and private expectations that may now be turning hostile. On the other side was a public brand that no longer looked as powerful, fresh, or commercially irresistible as it once did. The royal family, meanwhile, appeared distant and unmoved. Whatever emotional drama still existed, the institution itself seemed focused on survival, not rescue. There was no sign that anyone was preparing to step in and shield the couple from the consequences of the life they had chosen. That left them standing alone inside a very expensive version of freedom. By this point, the victim narrative looked less like a strategy for sympathy and more like a final attempt to regain control of a story that was slipping away. But if the public had already grown tired of the old script, then that effort might not save them. It might only confirm how desperate the situation had become. In the end, the image that once defined Harry and Meghan began to reverse itself. They were no longer the glamorous ex-royals building a bold new future on their own terms. They were beginning to look like two people trapped inside an empire of appearances that had become too costly to maintain. The mansion, the security, the brand, the lawsuits, the deals, and the carefully curated public image all now seemed connected by one uncomfortable truth. The life they had built depended on constant momentum, constant funding, and constant belief from other powerful people. And once that belief starts to disappear, everything starts to shake. What happens next may not be decided by public statements or glossy interviews. It may be decided by overdue payments, broken trust, court filings, and the private records that powerful people usually hope never become public. For years, Harry and Meghan presented their story as one of liberation. But if this pressure continues to build, that story may end up being remembered very differently. It may be remembered as a warning about what happens when image outruns reality, when prestige is mistaken for permanence, and when a life built on borrowed power finally reaches the moment when every debt demands an answer.